So in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 steps to heal your inner child. I released a video last week on what the inner child is. I will link it below, so for those of you who have questions, you can check that out. So a first step to healing our inner child is to acknowledge that we all have an inner child, is to become conscious of that fact. So if you're listening out there and you didn't have the big glaring memory of a childhood trauma, I think the way, most of us think of trauma, that doesn't mean that you didn't still suffer a wound from childhood, have an unmet emotional need. Some of these wounds are just consistent moments in time when we're very young, where our needs weren't acknowledged or weren't considered or weren't met in a way that felt good to us. So also remember, we don't necessarily need to have the memory of the thing that happened. Chances are we're still carrying the wound in our beliefs about ourselves, about our relationships. We're still carrying the wound in our reactions that we're seeing in our adult life. As an adult, we might look back on our childhood and think and review some scenes of it and think, okay, things weren't that bad. I often hear that a lot. This memory, this thing that happened wasn't so bad. It's important to remember that we're looking back from our adult self with awarenesses, with another level of emotional maturity, understanding more about ourselves, the world, other people. So from our adult self looking back, it might not seem that bad, but what we have to remember is at the time we were a child, we were making sense of the world in a different way. We had a different level of consciousness. So as a child, it might and probably did feel way worse than it does when we look back. So the first step in healing is to become aware that we all have this part of ourself. How do we know? We know because we are triggered. So what is a trigger? A trigger, really, to put it simply, is a disproportionate emotional reaction to something maybe smaller that happens in our current life. I'll use a personal example. One of my triggers for a very long time in my relationship was undone house chores, really the dishes, right? So I would come home and I would see dishes in the sink. I would find myself losing it. I would be upset. I threw dishes into the sink sometimes, disgruntled doing the dishes. And so that, right, that to me indicated the bigness of my reaction. I felt, a lot of different feelings on a really big level about dishes, right? So let's be honest here, our objective. Dishes really shouldn't, if you will, cause that much of a reaction. So that to me was an indicator that something deeper was going on. So those out there listening, this is a great red flag. If you find yourself consistently having a big feeling about something maybe not so big in reality, we should look deeper. And what we need to identify for ourselves is what's going on. What is the underlying emotion? So for me, the more I became aware, conscious of my internal world, I would notice that as I would see those dishes, my brain, my mind would start to say certain things. And what my mind said in response to these dishes was, how dare she? She doesn't care about me. I'm not being considered. So realizing that I had this narrative that I was saying to myself in response to these dishes, I think now we can understand why the feeling I was having was so big. Because to feel not considered felt hurtful to me, felt angering to me, and that's what provoked my yelling and screaming about the dishes. So it was important. Look at those big flags, look at your big feelings, and then dive down in there. Ask yourself, what is it about? What is the meaning? What is the underlying feeling that I'm having? Once I know, then I can ask my inner child what it needs to be, whatever the feeling is. So for me, it was, what does it need to be considered? So in that moment, being honest with myself and realizing that I wanted to be in an empowered place, so I wanted to be able to meet my own need of being considered, I was able to give myself a choice to do now 2 new things. I was able to do the dishes for myself because that was important. I like a clean kitchen, so I was able to consider myself by doing the dishes. And then I was able to consider myself and my inner child by doing something that I like to do, by putting myself first. So after the dishes, I was able to go and sit down and read for a little bit. I like to read. That makes me feel good. So in that way, I was able to leave that experience feeling good, feeling empowered, feeling positive about myself because of the new choices that I was able to make. If I would have ranted and raved about the dishes, which I did for a long time, I left that experience feeling badly, feeling shameful, sometimes feeling guilty because of the mean things that would come out of my mouth. And more often than not, my relationship was now in conflict. That didn't feel good. So by becoming aware that this was a wounded part of myself, by looking at what was driving that wound, not feeling considered, and by asking and meeting that need for myself and my child, by considering myself by doing the dishes, by considering myself by making a choice for me, I was able to leave that situation feeling so much more empowered. I was able to leave feeling replenished instead of depleted, as I would have felt if I would have screamed and yelled about the dishes. Now remember, this is really, really hard work. It took me a lot of repetition, a lot of observation of my child, a lot of exploration, and a lot of shifting into that awareness in that moment to make these new choices. So don't get frustrated as you try to unpack and explore and change your responses, because it's hard work. It takes consistent efforts, but it is so rewarding if you can understand these parts of ourselves, that they're there for all of us. Understand what these parts need, and now as the adult that we are, meet those needs on our own. So thank you guys for listening. If you like what you saw here today, please feel free to hit subscribe and turn on your alerts. Every Sunday I release a new YouTube video.